He smiled for the cameras, he flirted with the reporters, he robbed banks in broad daylight and shook hands with the bystanders. For a brief moment in American history, John Dillinger wasn't just the most wanted man in America, he was unstoppable. He walked through crowds, smiled at strangers, and posed for photographs without a care in the world, whilst being the most wanted man in 5 states. He broke out of jail twice, using nothing more than a piece of wood carved into a pistol, and publicly humiliated the law enforcement trying to catch him. To the newspapers, he was a bank-robbing genius. To the FBI, he was a humiliating problem. To the American people, many of whom had lost everything and held the bank responsible for the Great Depression, he was a legend. He didn't act like a thug, he didn't hide behind a mask. John robbed banks with charm, speed, and military precision, and for that, he became a hero. In response, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI launched a bold new strategy, using modern investigative techniques to transform his young FBI into a national crime-fighting force. By 1933, he had assembled a new breed of federal agents with one mission: hunt down the country's most dangerous outlaws. They were given a name: Public Enemies, and sitting at the very top of that list was John Dillinger. In less than a year, he robbed more than 20 banks, stole weapons from 4 police stations, broke out of 2 jails, and helped orchestrate the escape of some of the country's most dangerous inmates. He pulled off a jailbreak using nothing more than a piece of wood carved into a pistol, and somehow, every single time, he got away. Even seasoned gangsters like Babyface Nelson and Pretty Boy Floyd fell into his circle, joining him on jobs and watching him outthink and outsmart the men who were sent to stop him. By the summer of 1934, J. Edgar Hoover's agents were under pressure to deliver results. John's antics were making the FBI look like amateurs. Agents followed every lead whilst the reward on his head climbed higher, and it would all end outside a movie theatre in Chicago with 3 bullets, a collapsing body, and a crowd watching one of the most famous men in America bleed out on the sidewalk. But his story doesn't start with the fall. It begins in the heart of Indiana, with a restless boy, a broken home, and a lesson that no prison could ever teach. If you're going to steal, steal big and never get caught. This is the rise and fall of Public Enemy number 1, John Dillinger. June 22nd, 1903, Indianapolis. The night was heavy with summer heat, the kind that clings to skin and slows time. At 2 a.m, in a quiet home tucked into the modest Oak Hill neighbourhood, at 2053 Cooper Street, a baby's first cry cut through the still air. That baby was John Herbert Dillinger, the man who would one day become the FBI's public enemy number 1. His parents, John Wilson Dillinger and Mary Ellen Lancaster, had no way of knowing what kind of storm they had just brought into the world. John Sr. was a grocer, a church deacon, and a firm believer in discipline. Molly, on the other hand, was tender and soft-spoken, the calming centre of the household. Their teenage daughter, Audrey, had kept a diary predicting the baby's name. "It will either be John, Harold, Alfred or Harry," she wrote. They settled on John Herbert Dillinger, and the home was filled with love until it wasn't. In 1907, tragedy struck. Molly suffered a stroke and died during surgery. 4-year-old John didn't understand death. On the day of her funeral, he went missing. The family found him at the coffin, having dragged a chair beside it. He was reaching up, trying to shake his mother awake. "It wrung my heart," John Sr. recalled later, to see John's bewilderment at her continued absence. His sister Audrey returned home to care for him, though she was pregnant herself. She did her best, but the sadness in the house lingered. When Audrey left again, John was alone. In 1913, his father remarried to a shy countrywoman named Elizabeth Fields. At first, John resented the affection his father gave Lizzie, but over time, she became one of the few people he truly trusted. By 12, John was already running a gang of local boys called the Dirty Dozen. They stole coal straight off Pennsylvania railroad cars and sold it for whatever they could get. It was small time, but it marked the start of a life built on crime and control. One day, John, who was gaining a reputation as a bully, tied a boy to a sawmill conveyor and let the blade get within inches before stopping it. He thought it was hilarious, and the rest of the Dirty Dozen laughed with him. Eventually, they got caught. Dragged into juvenile court, most of the boys trembled before the judge, but not John. He stood tall, gum in mouth, arms folded, cap pulled low over his brow. When the judge ordered him to spit out the gum and remove the cap, John peeled the gum from his teeth and pressed it into the brim of his hat. The judge stared at him for a moment and then said flatly, "Your mind is crippled." Back home, his father tried to beat the rebellion out of him. Whippings, groundings and stern lectures, but nothing worked. One time, John gave a girl a stolen chewing gum and his father slapped him so hard that he bled. But John didn't even flinch. He just stared back, dead into his father's eyes, and that really was the first glimpse of the dark side of young Johnny. Despite continuously failing at his school, John loved reading, especially the novels about Jesse James. He admired James not just for his daring, but for his code, robbing the rich and protecting women and children. It was clear that John didn't just want to read about outlaws, he wanted to become one. At 16, he dropped out of school. Not for lack of intelligence, as he was mechanically gifted, it's just that he saw no value in it. He started working at a veneer mill as a mechanic. He loved tearing engines apart and putting them back together, but he didn't love rules, schedules, or structure. Seeing how John was drifting, ignoring authority, skipping responsibilities, and showing no signs of settling down, his father had had enough. In 1917, he sold the grocery store, sold 4 houses, and moved the family to a 62-acre farm in Mooresville, Indiana. The farm was located along Old State Road 267, today's North Monroe Street, at Northridge Drive, offering a quiet, rural escape from the growing bustle of Indianapolis. He had hoped that country life and a new school would tame his son, but it didn't. Life at the Mooresville farm, despite a good start, didn't stay peaceful for long. The tension between John and his father kept building, and before long, it was clear that they couldn't live under the same roof. Unwilling to live by his father's strict rules, John packed up and left Mooresville. He landed in Martinsville, just down the road, but it felt like a different world. There, he found a new kind of education, not in classrooms, but in the haze of smoke-filled pool halls. His regular hangout was the More and Peace pool room, located in the basement of 1 West Main Street. He spent most of his time there, hustling games, gambling for cash, and learning how to talk his way in and out of just about anything. Days turned into nights, and John drifted from one table to the next, always chasing the next thrill. And that's where he met Frances Thornton, who was his uncle's stepdaughter. So she was sharp, fiery and beautiful, and John fell for her fast. He proposed, but her stepfather didn't approve, and under pressure, Frances turned him down. John was absolutely heartbroken. He never spoke to her again, and from that point on, that's when things really began to spiral. John grew restless. He was chasing something, maybe love, maybe just a sense of belonging. But whatever it was, he wasn't finding it in Martinsville. He had a weakness for women, and was always looking for connection, though it rarely turned into anything real. In Martinsville, he tried his luck with the local girls, but most of them turned him away. Frustrated and still searching, he made his way back to Indianapolis, where he began spending time in the city's shady corners. There, the company came easier, but at a price. His nights with prostitutes eventually left him with a case of gonorrhea, just one more sign that things were beginning to spin out of control. Rumours swirled that he got a girl in Indianapolis pregnant. So, on July the 21st, 1923, he asked to borrow his father's car, to go and see that very girl, but his father refused. Frustrated and impulsive, John couldn't make sense of things and decided to do what he thought was best, and so he stole a car from a church parking lot. However, he didn't get very far as a policeman caught him wandering through the streets of Indianapolis in the early hours looking for engine oil. When the cop tried to call it in, John realised that he was going to get himself caught, and he left the car behind and bolted away. Realising he was in trouble and needing a way out fast, John made a drastic move. The very next day, he enlisted in the US Navy, but that too didn't last long. He survived boot camp, but life aboard the USS Utah, shoveling coal into massive boilers, was miserable. He went AWOL twice, got locked in the brig, and finally deserted for good on December the 4th, 1923, while the ship was docked in Boston. The Navy issued a $50 bounty on his head, so he vanished for 2 months. Some said he was hiding with the same girl from Indianapolis, but when he returned to Mooresville to his father, he lied, claiming that he'd been discharged from the Navy due to a heart condition. In early 1924, John met Beryl Hovius, a sweet 16-year-old from a poor family. They married on April the 12th, with Beryl lying about her age to slip past the law. Some said she was just a rebound from Francis, but for a little while, they looked happy. She quit school, took a job as a waitress, and the two settled in a tiny upstairs apartment in Martinsville. John jumped from job to job, machinist, upholsterer, but nothing stuck. That summer, he played ball for the local team, Martinsville Athletics baseball team, and there he met Ed Singleton, a 30-year-old petty thief with a drinking problem and a love for telling prison stories. Singleton had everything to attract John to him: a rough past and a twisted sense of ambition. John was hooked on every one of his stories. One night, over shots of White Mule moonshine, Singleton pitched an idea to John. Old Frank Morgan, a grocer John knew from his childhood in Mooresville, walked home every Saturday night from his store at 135 West High Street, carrying the day's cash in his pocket. Singleton had been watching him. Easy money, he said, and John agreed. On September the 6th, 1924, the night was cool. Frank Morgan, done with his haircut, took his usual route home. Outside the First Christian Church on South Jefferson Street in Mooresville, John leapt from the shadows. He had a .32 caliber pistol in one hand and a heavy bolt wrapped in cloth in the other. He swung hard and the bolt smashed Morgan's straw hat, but the grocer didn't go down. Morgan grabbed for John's gun and it fired, grazing his hand. Lights came on, neighbours shouted, Morgan screamed, and John ran away with a measly amount of $50, which is about $800 in today's money, so all that trouble for nothing significant. He sprinted to the getaway car, but Singleton was gone. He was spooked by the gunshot and he'd fled, so John was alone and he panicked. He walked the 15 miles back to Martinsville and he went straight back to the More and Peace pool hall. He tried to play it cool there, but the blood on his pants gave him away. 2 days later, on September the 8th, the sheriff and town marshal came to the Dillinger farm. "Get your coat, John, you're coming with us." He didn't resist. They told him that Morgan had identified him, which was a lie, but it didn't matter. His father, believing confession would bring mercy, urged his son to tell the truth, which he did. He also named Ed Singleton as his accomplice, but when Singleton was arrested, he flipped, claiming John had acted alone. At sentencing, Singleton's hired lawyer entered a not guilty plea and got the case reassigned. Ed got just 2 to 14 years, but John, who had no lawyer and no defence, faced Judge Joseph Warford Williams, one of the toughest on the bench.
Williams sentenced John to 10 to 20 years at Indiana State Reformatory, which was a ridiculously harsh punishment for a first-time offender who'd stolen just $50. Even Judge Williams, who issued the sentence, felt regret later, telling a Chicago newspaper that I wanted to scare him, not make him a criminal. As he boarded the transfer wagon to prison, he turned to the superintendent and said calmly, "I won't cause you any trouble except to escape." And, well, John meant it.
Indiana State Reformatory, fall 1924. The red brick walls loomed like something out of a medieval nightmare. The harsh clang of iron bars, the heavy scent of sweat and scorched metal, and the oppressive heat hit John like a freight train. At just 21 years old, he was inmate 14395, fresh meat, isolated and betrayed. Sentenced to spend a decade trapped behind walls, he was already plotting to escape. Within weeks, John began pushing the limits. During a routine head count, he simply vanished, sending the guards into a frenzy as they stormed through the cell block, barking orders in a panic. An hour later, they found him curled up in a pile of wood shavings in the foundry, dust and sweat coating to his clothes. The supervisor, furious, threatened to light a match to force him out, but John sprang up like a jack-in-the-box, grinning defiantly. The stunt earned him 6 extra months, but he didn't care. Weeks later, justice, or what passed for it, came down on his old accomplice, Ed Singleton. In an Indiana courtroom, John sat cuffed as Frank Morgan took the stand. Singleton, slick-haired and smug, watched the jury with a gambler's grin. The verdict came in 20 minutes, guilty. But instead of prison, Singleton walked away with a $25 fine and a conspiracy charge. The same man who abandoned John got just a slap on the wrist.
On the train ride back to prison, Deputy Russell Peterson kept a sharp eye on John. He sat quietly, but inside, rage boiled. 10 years for him while Singleton walked away scot-free. When Peterson let him sit down to drink a soda as they were approaching Indianapolis Station, John snapped. With one swift motion, he flipped the table, sending Peterson sprawling. Then, like a greyhound on leash, John dashed out of the station. He tore through the twisting alleys of Indianapolis, his coat flapping, his heart pounding. The chase ended at a dead-end alley where the deputy caught him once again. However, justice would eventually be served. Singleton's life, well, that took a darker turn. He was eventually caught up in small-time scams and turned to heavy drinking, and his luck finally ran out on September the 2nd, 1937, when he passed out drunk on some railroad tracks. He never woke up, and a freight train rolled through that night, ending his story for good.
By November 1924, just 3 months into his prison sentence, he was trying to escape again, this time with hacksaws and 2 other inmates. They cut through the bars and planned to vanish before Christmas. He told his wife Beryl, "Be ready, I'm coming home." They were caught in the corridor minutes from freedom, and John had another 6 months added. Which wasn't good news for him, as Indiana State Reformatory was its own brand of hell. A prison built for 1,200 inmates, it was now bursting with more than double that number. The guards pulled endless shifts, their tempers high and eyes hollow. To make matters worse, John was assigned to work in the foundry where the heat reached 130 degrees, the kind of heat that cooked a man from the inside out. Noise ricocheted off the iron walls like bullets. Shouts, machinery, and the constant clang of metal on metal began grating on him. John, trapped in that furnace-like inferno, snapped. He poured molten steel onto his shoe, hoping to earn a transfer to the infirmary. When that didn't work, he escalated, burning the wound with acid, and that was successful in getting the guard's attention as he was finally shifted to yard duty. John's anger slowly turned outward. Each day behind bars, his resentment towards society hardened. He felt betrayed by the courts, the judge, the system that threw the book at him while Singleton walked away. Inside, he found comfort in the company of seasoned criminals. He listened to their stories, soaked up their methods, and began to understand how real crime worked. When he finally accepted that escaping the prison wasn't viable, he made himself a promise. "I'll be the meanest bastard you ever saw when I get out of here," he told prison guards. By 1927, after 3 years behind bars, the reckless kid had started to fade. A new version of John was taking shape, colder, smarter, patient. No more fights, no more stunts. He cleaned up, took orders, wrote letters to Beryl, and promised her that he'd change. He got a spot in the prison shirt factory, running a Tomcat sewing machine, stitching uniforms one after the other. But behind the needle, John was studying, watching, listening, and plotting. He met Homer Van Meter, a wiry, loud-mouthed outlaw from Fort Wayne. Arrested for armed robbery, Homer had a manic energy, like dynamite which could go off at any second. He joked, schemed, and laughed, even in solitary confinement, but he was smart and he was dangerous. Then came Harry Pierpont, smooth, stone cold, blue-eyed, and fearless. He'd already done time, already robbed banks, and carried the weight of a man who'd been betrayed by love and by life. Where Homer was in chaos, Harry was in control. Every word he spoke had a purpose, every glance had a calculation. For a while, the three of them formed a kind of alliance, not built on friendship exactly, but on respect and a mutual understanding that they didn't belong in that prison forever.
But then Van Meter and Pierpont were gone. They were transferred to Michigan City State Prison, and John felt their absence immediately. He lost his routine, he lost the camaraderie and the edge that had kept him balanced. With nothing to focus on, he spiralled once more and was eventually caught stealing vegetables from the prison garden, cooking in his cell, and hiding a razor blade under the floorboards. It wasn't long before he was thrown back into solitary confinement, and he had another 6 months added onto his sentence. In April of 1929, Beryl came to visit, but instead of comfort or hope, she brought divorce papers. Calmly, almost coldly, she told him, "I filed for divorce," and within weeks, it was final. By June, she had married another man, and from behind bars, John wrote her letter after letter, pouring out everything he still felt for her. "All I want is to be with you and make you happy," he pleaded. But no reply ever came, and somewhere in his silence between his words and her absence, John came to terms with the truth. Whatever they had was gone, and it wasn't coming back.
In June 1929, he went before the parole board. Governor Harry Leslie even came to watch him play shortstop during a prison baseball game. John played well, having a natural talent, but it wasn't enough. His record was still a mess, and no amount of charm could erase it. His parole was denied, and so he tried a different approach. "I want to be transferred to Michigan City," he told Leslie. "I want to play on their baseball team." Michigan City State Prison's baseball team was widely considered one of the best in Indiana at the time. The team was packed with tough, experienced players, some of them even having semi-pro level experience. John was a solid player with a strong arm and a real love for the game, but his talent was raw, more street-learned than polished. and not nearly refined enough to earn a place on the prison's official team, which was made up of serious athletes. John had little chance of making that team, but still Leslie, a ball player himself, saw something worth encouraging. It could be something for him later, Leslie wrote on his transfer papers, as the request was granted, and on July 15th, 1929, John Dillinger entered Michigan's City State Prison. He was now entering the big leagues, and that's where the real criminal education began. John was assigned to Shop 8A, working once again at a sewing machine, but this time he was joined by Homer Van Meter, Harry Pierpont, and Walter Dietrich, a veteran bank robber known for his calm focus and careful planning. Dietrich introduced the group to the Lamb technique, a structured approach to bank robbery developed by the German criminal Hermann the Baron Lamb. The method involves scouting the bank, studying the layout in detail, assigning specific roles such as lookout, vaultman, and driver, and practicing the entire operation until the timing was exact. Escape routes, known as gits, were planned for every possible condition. It was a method based on preparation and control. Before this, bank robberies were messy with chaotic shootouts, sloppy getaways, and unnecessary bloodshed. The Lamb technique changed all that. It brought military-style discipline to crime, something that the law had never seen before. As John continued his apprenticeship, Pierpont explained that when the moment came, they would leave the prison, but they needed assistance from the outside. Someone who had not yet been marked by the system, and John himself was the perfect candidate for this role. To the law, he was just a petty thief from Mooresville, not a seasoned bank robber like the rest. "Help us get out," Pierpont said, "and you'll be the driver." John accepted the offer without even flinching.
From that point forward, he spent his time in prison learning everything: how to identify suitable banks, how to handle and sell stolen bonds, how to make connections with people who could resell the goods, and how to organise a team that could carry out the plan effectively. He also learned how to avoid violence unless there was absolutely no other option. The focus was always on speed, precision and control, and over the next few years John learned everything that the guys inside could teach him. The troubled young man from Mooresville, well, he changed, and when he left Shop 8A, the truth was that he was no longer the same person who entered.
By early 1933, it was time to put the plan in motion. Audrey, John's sister, had spent years writing letters and gathering support for her brother. Hundreds of residents from his hometown of Mooresville added their names to a petition asking for his parole, totaling up to 188 signatures. Amongst them was Frank Morgan, the grocer John had attacked during the robbery that led to his sentence. Even Judge Williams, who had sentenced John in 1924, agreed to support his release. This time, the request was not ignored. On May 10th, 1933, Governor Paul McNutt signed Executive Order 7723, officially approving John's parole. 12 days later, on May 22nd, John walked out of Michigan State Prison. He was dressed in a second-hand suit and carried a $10 bill, the standard amount given to men leaving the facility. As he stepped through the gates, he looked back and said quietly, "I'd rather be dead than ever go back in there." And he meant it. He wouldn't ever spend more than 2 weeks behind bars. His apprenticeship was over, the student had graduated, and the banks of America were about to find out just what he had learned. John Dillinger stepped out of Michigan State Prison, not just a free man, but a man on a mission. Behind those gates, locked away in sweat-drenched cells and stinking shirt factories, were the very men who had trained him, mentored him, shaped him: Pierpont, Van Meter, Dietrich. They were still inside, and John had every intention of setting them free. He didn't waste a second. Just weeks after his release, John was already laying the groundwork. But breaking men out of prison wasn't cheap. It needed cash, and lots of it. And America was in the depths of the Great Depression, so John turned to the very thing that made him wait all those years behind the bars, rented an apartment at 324 West 1st Street in Dayton, Ohio, and linked up with two names from Pierpont's circle, William Shaw and Paul Parker, of whom no pictures have survived of. John introduced himself as Dan Dillinger, trying to keep things quiet. Shaw, along with his shady friend Noble Claycomb, of whom no photographs have survived of either, was connected to a group known as the White Cap Gang. They were small-time crooks who knocked over local groceries and gas stations for nickels and dimes, but they were connected, and that's what John needed. Their first job was a supermarket in Dayton that yielded just $100. It wasn't enough to buy ammo, let alone bribe a guard or smuggling guns, but it was a start. John needed a bigger score, and the real break came when he, Shaw and Parker targeted the new Carlisle National Bank in Ohio. It was John's first bank job, his true debut in what would become a long line of historic heists, and it went off without a hitch. No shots fired, no alarms tripped, just clean timing, nerves of steel, and fast driving. The total haul was over $10,000, nearly $250,000 today, which was quite literally a small fortune in the middle of the Great Depression. But John wasn't done. Riding high from that win, the crew knocked over a drugstore and another supermarket, adding another $3,600 to the prison break fund. But with every score came a clearer vision. John wasn't impressed by his partners. Shaw and Parker were sloppy, nervous, and too comfortable in small-time life, and John was aiming higher. Then came the job that cracked the cracks wide open. Just after midnight on July the 15th, 1933, they stormed into the Bideawee Inn at Burlington and 12th in Muncie, Indiana. Guns drawn, voices sharp, the takeaway was just $70. It was quick, messy and reckless, and by 6 a.m, the getaway car was found outside a boarding house just a few blocks away. By 9 a.m, the law had their names. Noble Claycomb, Paul Parker, and William Shaw were in handcuffs. John barely blinked. He was moving on, already recruiting his next accomplice, a slick 30-year-old thief named Harry Copeland. On July the 17th, they took a journey to Daleville, Indiana, a tiny town with a single target, a small bank called the Commercial Bank of Daleville, located at 7850 South Walnut Street. Inside, Teller Margaret Good glanced up from her desk to see a well-dressed, polite young man asking to speak with the bank president. "The president isn't in," she replied. John smiled, then pulled a gun. "Well, honey," he said coolly, "this is a stick-up." And before you knew it, in the spur of a moment, John jumped over the railing like a gymnast, landing inside the vault in one smooth motion. It was showmanship, a calculated move. He filled his bag with $3,500 whilst Copeland ordered everyone into the vault, and the duo walked out without so much as a scratch.
The acrobatic leap over the counter, mid-robbery, became legend. It earned him the nickname of the Jackrabbit, and it put him directly on the radar of Captain Matt Leach of the Indiana State Police, who had been tracking robberies across the state. But something about this one was different. The cool demeanour, the flair, the confidence, it was unlike anything that the authorities had ever seen before. But while lawmen tightened their grip, John's attention drifted towards something softer, something personal. A name had been buzzing around the prison before his release: Mary Longnecker, sister of one of his former inmates, James Jenkins. At Jenkins's request, John promised to check on her when he got out. He saw her photo and grinned as she was quite an attractive young lady and said, "I don't mind if I do."
In July 1933, John drove his Chevy down to Mary's apartment in Dayton. At first, the visit was strictly business. He wanted to talk about using her to pass bribes to the guards at Michigan prison, hoping to secure her brother's escape. Innocent women like Mary could move more freely, drawing less suspicion, making them perfect couriers for delicate tasks. But when John saw her beauty and charm up close, something changed, and John found himself falling for her fast. He started writing her long love letters full of desperation. "Honey, I miss you like nobody's business," he wrote, "and I don't mean maybe. I hope I can spend more time with you, for baby, I fell for you in a big way, and if you'll be on the level, I'll give everybody the go-by for you, and that isn't a lot of hooey either. I know you like me, dear, but that isn't enough for me when I'm as crazy as I am about you. You may never get to feel the same towards me as I do you, in which case I would be better off not to see you very much, for it would be hell for me. Lots of love, from Johnny." But Mary stayed cautious. She was already seeing another man, someone more stable, more suitable. Still, she didn't shut John out completely. He was, after all, the one trying to free her brother from prison. Meanwhile, Captain Leach was closing in. He received a tip that John was in touch with a woman in Dayton. Her name was unknown, but she was linked to a Michigan City inmate. Leach contacted the Dayton police and quietly launched a sting. Unknown to the scheme unfolding behind him, John and Copeland were already back on the move, knocking over banks across Indiana and Ohio, collecting every dollar they could for the breakouts. At 11:55 a.m. on Monday, the 14th of August 1933, John Dillinger and Copeland stormed into the Bluffton Citizen National Bank. They were armed, without masks, and they moved fast. Inside, only 3 employees and a lone customer stood frozen as the gang took control. The job was sharp and quick, done in under 5 minutes. But just as things were wrapping up, an alarm screamed through the building. Seconds later, the town's whistle joined in, echoing through Bluffton's streets. Tension spiked and the duo panicked. In a frenzy, they unleashed 30 warning shots, most fired into the air, to keep the growing crowd at bay as they forced their way out. By the time that Bluffton's marshal had arrived at the bank, the duo had already vanished. Then came the big one. On September the 6th, the payroll for the real silk hosiery mill was held inside the Massachusetts Avenue State Bank in Indianapolis. John walked in wearing a straw hat, casually settling cross-legged atop a 7-foot barrier as if he owned the place. True to his style, he savoured the dramatic flair. With a smile like he was at a dinner party, he levelled his Thompson submachine gun at the manager. The take was a staggering $25,000, over $500,000 today, and the final piece of the prison break puzzle was complete. John had the funds, now he just needed to pull the trigger. John left Dayton and travelled to Kokomo, Indiana. He connected with 2 key women in Pierpont's inner circle. Pearl Elliott, a madam who was an expert at passing bribes and greasing the right palms, and Mary Kinder, Pierpont's flame, who was tasked with securing a safe apartment for the escaped men. John rented a room off Pearl, staying in her brothel on the corner of Washington and Madison Street in Kokomo. With their help, John bought firearms and tossed a package containing the guns and ammunition over the prison wall. It was bold, it was desperate, and it failed. An inmate found the bundle, tried to be a good Samaritan, and turned it in. The warden, however, overreacted and put the inmate into solitary confinement instead. The plan turned out to be a bust, but the outside network held strong. Pearl smuggled out a letter from Pierpont. He gave new orders and decided to implement a new method. The next batch of weapons would be hidden in boxes of thread, delivered directly into the shirt factory, where the gang worked, and staying true to his promise, John made it happen. The breakout was rescheduled for September the 30th.
8 days before that, on September the 22nd, John took one last detour back to Dayton. He hadn't seen Mary in weeks. This was a risky move because the prison breakout plan was nearly complete, but maybe he just wanted to see her, or maybe he wanted to feel more than a bank robber again, or maybe he needed to know if her heart had changed. But she wasn't alone anymore.
The Dayton police, tired of waiting, had secretly moved 2 detectives into her boarding house right across the hall from the room that John used to stay in. They intercepted his letters, reading every page of his desperation and pain. They didn't know when he would show again, but they knew he would, and that's exactly what happened. Just after midnight, the Dayton Police Department picked up a call. It was the landlady of 324 West 1st Street, nervous, breathless, and doing exactly what the police had told her. Call them the second she even saw his shadow. John Dillinger had returned. "He's here," she said. "Who's here?" they asked. "John Dillinger, you dumb flatfoot," she told the operator. In minutes they stormed the boarding house. They found John in Mary's room. He was calm and quiet, arrested on the spot and taken to the station without kicking up a fuss. This was awful news for the Michigan City boys because a week before the escape, the man who had planned it all, the one who had raised the money, coordinated the couriers and arranged the drop, was behind bars once again. Despite this, back in Michigan City prison, the real work began. The first gun drop had failed, but that didn't stop the breakout plan. Pierpont sent new instructions from the inside to Copeland on the outside, who was responsible for the delivery of the new package. The second shipment would be hidden in a crate of thread and delivered to the shirt factory storeroom where Walter Dietrich worked. It arrived on schedule. Tucked beneath spools of thread were 4 loaded pistols. Dietrich moved quickly, removing the weapons and hiding them until the time was right. The plan had originally been set for September the 30th, but nerves were running high and there were too many whispers in the air. Pierpont moved the date up to September the 26th, 1933. Rain poured over the prison that afternoon. In the shirt factory storeroom, all 10 men in on the plan: Harry Pierpont, James Clark, Charles Mackley, John Hamilton, James Jenkins, Russell Clark, Ed Schaus, John Burns, Walter Dietrich, and Joseph Fox gathered quietly. Pierpont, Mackley and Hamilton took the real pistols. The rest carried carved wooden fakes they'd been working on in their cells, and they were good enough to bluff. First, they pulled a gun on the shirt factory superintendent and marched him out like it was just another supply delivery. Each man carried a stack of folded shirts. At the rear, they brought along a massive guard nicknamed Big Bertha, a 300-pound hulk who was forced to unlock the jail's armory. While the gang held guards at gunpoint, they changed into new clothes and gathered weapons. Warden Lewis Kunkel heard the noise and rushed to investigate, only to freeze as Pierpont shoved a pistol into his stomach. "Don't be a dead hero," Pierpont warned. They made their move across the yard, but guards in the towers spotted them and opened fire. In the chaos, James Jenkins, Mary Longnecker's brother, the very reason John had pursued Mary in the first place, was shot and killed instantly. A brief gun battle erupted, but the rest of the gang pushed through, sprinting through the open gate into the pouring rain. It was the largest prison break in Indiana history. 2 cars were taken, one from a sheriff at gunpoint at the gates who had just arrived, the other from a gas station from across the street. The gang split up and sped off into the storm. They vanished into the Indiana countryside, heading southeast towards Hamilton, Ohio. The safe house had been arranged by Mary Kinder, Pierpont's mistress, and there they regrouped with dry clothes, warm food, and everything they needed. But their partner was still locked up in Dayton. And for another prison break for John, they didn't have enough weapons or enough cash. They needed a score, something big enough to cover everything. Then, in a stroke of inspiration, Charles Mackley brought up a target, an old bank named St. Mary's Bank in his hometown of St. Mary's, Ohio. The building had been closed by the Treasury, but a large deposit sat inside, meant for a future reopening. so the plan was executed. Mackley and Pierpont walked in carrying a map and acted lost. The cashier looked up to help and found a gun pointed at his face. The gang walked out with $11,000, roughly $200,000 today, with no resistance faced and no alarms raised. It was enough for guns, gas, and the muscle they needed next. Now they could go and get John. Pierpont hatched a plan to scout the layout of the Allen County Jail where John was held, back in Lima. He brought in a woman from his circle, Billy Frechette, a dark-haired beauty of mixed French and Menominee ancestry from Neopit, Wisconsin. She was the best friend of Patricia Sherrington, the girlfriend of John Hamilton, and she would pretend to be John's sister and request a visit to the jail. The idea was simple: send Billy in, make her map out the interior, and then plan accordingly. Billy proved herself useful and recited the details of the interior to the gang, who then, on October the 12th, 1933, approached the front desk of the Allen County Jail. Pierpont, Mackley and Russell Clark were all armed. Inside, Sheriff Saber and his wife had just finished dinner and were sitting in the office. "We're officers from Michigan City," Pierpont said coolly, "and we're here to take John Dillinger." "Let me see your credentials," he asked. Pierpont pulled a pistol. "Here they are." Saber reached for his desk drawer, but it was too late.
Two shots rang out. One pierced Saber's left side, tore through his abdomen and lodged in his thigh. Saber crumpled to the floor, but he was still conscious and still resisting. So Mackley stepped in and clubbed him with the butt of his pistol, accidentally discharging another round into the wall. Mrs. Saber, trembling, eventually handed over the keys. They opened the jail door where John stood waiting. Pierpont tossed him a gun and together they stormed out of the jail. Past the bodies, past the horror, they didn't look back. Not once. Not even realising that they had just murdered Sheriff Saber, who would die a few hours later from his wounds. The blueprint had been drawn, the breakout executed, and now the Michigan City crew was loose.
By October 1933, John Dillinger and his crew were a national headline. His prison escape had shocked the Midwest. Newspapers dubbed him a criminal genius. Children wrote, but the gang wasn't celebrating. Hamilton walked in. "Go to the next window, please," the head teller Harold Graham, unaware of the storm about to break, said. Mackley stepped forward, gun already raised, voice cutting through the room like a blade. Graham flinched in panic, and his sudden movement made Mackley pull the trigger.
Two shots rang out and Graham dropped, bleeding from the elbow and the hip. But before the darkness closed in, his hands slammed the silent alarm. As chaos broke loose and while everyone was being told to lie down on their stomach by Pierpont, two policemen entered, expecting a false alarm, and the timing couldn't be worse.
However, Mackley didn't hesitate. He opened fire as a sergeant named Wilbur Hansen stepped through the doorway, hitting him twice before Hansen could even draw his gun. The loud sound of gunfire sent panic through the room as women screamed and customers dove for the floor. Pierpont barked orders whilst John vaulted the counter, scooping cash into bags. With the silent alarm already triggered and sirens closing in, they grabbed two hostages, a bookkeeper and the bank president, and pushed out into the street. They fled with $27,000 in hand, firing rounds into the air to clear a path through the crowd and keep the police at bay. Moments later, the hostages were found unharmed, released just blocks from the scene as the gang vanished into the Wisconsin countryside. Yet again, flush with cash, the gang laid low in luxury. They rented a beach house at 901 Atlantic Street in Daytona Beach, Florida, celebrated Christmas, and rang in the new year under palm trees. But not everything was sunny. Billy and John began fighting, something that was becoming a usual routine for them. John sent her back to Wisconsin, choosing to remain behind in Daytona alone whilst the other men drank and laughed with their wives and girlfriends. The isolation hit him harder than anyone could have expected, leaving him withdrawn and quietly aching for the one person who made him feel grounded. By early January 1934, the walls were closing in. The gang made their way back to Chicago after pulling off heists their wake. They had the money, they had the firepower, but what they didn't have was peace. Chicago, once their haven, had grown too hot.
By now, John Dillinger wasn't just a criminal, he was a sensation. To a country crushed under the weight of the Great Depression, he was more than just a bank robber, he was a symbol of rebellion, a man striking back at the very institutions that they blamed for their suffering. The media couldn't get enough of him. Newspapers painted him as a charismatic outlaw, a modern-day Robin Hood with a Tommy gun and a smile. His daring heists, his smooth getaways and his cool demeanour turned him into a folk hero, and the American public fell head over heels. They cheered his exploits, traded stories of his charm and audacity, and watched in awe as he stuck two fingers up to the system. But fame is a double-edged sword, and all that attention brought heat, and a lot of it. On their heels was the newly formed Dillinger Squad, a hand-picked team of seasoned detectives from the Chicago Police Department, led by the relentless Captain John Steege. Their sole mission was to hunt down John Dillinger and bring his gang to justice. Sensing that the walls were closing in, Pierpont proposed a bold solution: disappear entirely, leave the Midwest behind, escape the constant shadow of the law, and find a quiet place where no one knew their names.
Despite the press lauding John, Pierpont was the leader of the Dillinger gang, and he had Tucson, Arizona in mind, a desert town far from the Midwest bloodhounds who were following the gang's scent. Bolton himself was also hit by a bullet, wounded but still breathing. The two escaped with $22,000, a substantial sum but one that came at a steep cost. This near fatal shootout intensified the manhunt and escalated Dillinger's notoriety, now marked as a cop killer. The fatal bullet that struck Officer O'Malley would change everything, setting in motion the largest manhunt in history for Dillinger and his gang. Still, the gang pressed west. After nearly a week on the road, John and Billy were close to Tucson. Pierpont, Mackley and Russell Clark were already there, laying low in the Hotel Congress, located at 311 East Congress Street, under false names.
From the Hotel Congress, Dillinger prank called both John Steege and Frank Reynolds. Laughing, he mocked them for missing him completely while he pulled off a bank robbery practically in their backyard. He reminded them that despite being the most recognisable face in America, the country's most wanted man, he was still one step ahead. This wasn't a taunt, it was pure humiliation, despite the heist resulting in the death of an officer. The duo were livid, but luck had finally turned against the Dillinger gang, who were now known as the Terror Gang after the cop killing. On July the 23rd, a short circuit in the Hotel Congress sparked a fire on the third floor, the floor where Charles Mackley and Russell Clark were staying. As smoke spread and guests were evacuated, the gang faced the threat of losing their belongings and their cash to the flames. Refusing to let their valuables burn, Russell Clark and Charles Mackley bribed firefighters to climb back up the ladders and retrieve their luggage, including a suspiciously heavy black bag that weighed far more than just clothes, and metal clinked inside it as it was passed down to the firefighters. One firefighter, William Benedict, grew suspicious of their behaviour. Days later, whilst flipping through an issue of the True Detective magazine, he recognised Mackley's photo from the wanted list. Without hesitation, Benedict alerted the Tucson police, who then began carefully tracking the gang over the next 4 days. This vigilance led to the eventual capture of the members, John Dillinger himself being the last to be caught. At the time of his arrest, Dillinger was carrying $7,000 in cash, most of which could be traced directly back to the East Chicago bank robbery.
The Tucson jail became a madhouse once it was filled with the terror gang. Reporters swarmed the place, journalists scribbled notes like their pencils were on fire. Everyone wanted a quote, a photo, a headline. John stood in the centre of it all, not smiling, but not worried either. Just that cool half grin, like he expected all of this. Reynolds would be the one to lock him in chains. The moment Dillinger emerged from the plane, the press surged forward like a crashing wave, cameras flashing with relentless intensity, their bulbs popping like fireworks as journalists shouted questions and jostled for position, desperate to capture the face of the man who had become a living legend. A crowd had already gathered behind the barricades, hundreds deep and growing by the second. Ordinary people craning their necks, climbing onto benches, rooftops, anything they could, just to catch a glimpse of the man who had robbed banks, mocked the law, and somehow made the whole country fall in love with him. He was shackled tightly and shoved into the back of Reynolds' cruiser, chained at the wrists and ankles, flanked on both sides by grim-faced officers, yet even in custody, Dillinger looked calm, almost amused, like a man who was just enjoying the ride. As the motorcade tore through the streets of Chicago, sirens howling and lights painting the buildings in streaks of red and blue, bystanders lined the sidewalks, whispering, cheering, pointing as the procession flew past. Mothers hoisted their children onto their shoulders, old men tipped their hats in silent admiration, teenage boys shouted his name like he was a movie star, a folk hero, a gangster god riding to his next great act. He wasn't just an outlaw anymore, he was an American myth, larger than life and adored by a public that had come to see him not as a criminal, but as a symbol of rebellion against a system they all felt had failed them. The motorcade's destination was Crown Point Jail in Indiana. But for a moment, it felt like Dillinger wasn't headed for a cell. He was riding through the very heart of the American imagination, a man immortalized before the bars had even closed behind him. Waiting for him at Crown Point Jail was Sheriff Lillian Holly, the only female sheriff in the state, filling in for her husband who had been killed in the line of duty. She welcomed John with quiet authority. 20 minutes after arriving at Crown Point, John Dillinger wasn't thrown into isolation or buried in shackles. He was handed the spotlight by prosecutor Robert Still, who was eager to show off the catch of the decade. But it wasn't a Still who stole the show, it was John, chewing gum, smiling like a movie star, dressed in dark slacks and a clean white shirt, collar undone, playing it cool while flashing just enough menace. He leaned into every question with swagger. He teased, he dodged, he half confessed. When someone brought up the Michigan City jailbreak, he shrugged. Why not? He stuck by his friends, he said, and his friends stuck by him. That was the code. Reporters shouted, photographers snapped, and flashes lit up the room. Then came the infamous photo mishap, the one that would haunt Still's career. One photographer shouted for prosecutor Robert Still to put his arm around John. Still, caught off guard, obeyed. John leaned in, resting his elbow on Still's shoulder, wearing that same devilish grin. The photo hit newspapers across the country, and it made John look like a movie star.
For Still, it was a complete disaster. That photo of him standing next to John, grinning like they were old friends, stuck to him for years. It dragged through every step of his political career. That single image cost him the governor's seat. But for John, it was something else entirely. It added to his legend. The charm, the swagger, it was on full display, and behind that grin, he already knew what was coming next. So did everyone else. He kept the press fed, cracking jokes, smiling for the cameras, charming every reporter in the room. He straight up denied killing Officer O'Malley, claiming that he was in Florida at the time. He also claimed that he didn't drink much, he barely smoked. The only thing he was hooked on, he said, was robbing banks. He even joked about mailing How to Be a Detective to Matt Leach for Christmas, bringing Sergeant Frank Reynolds along on one of his bank heists to show the Dillinger squad how he robbed a bank. The reporters couldn't get enough of it. But for John, this wasn't just a performance. John was shaping something bigger. He wasn't just a bank robber anymore, he was now building a myth. And while the law scrambled to figure out what to do with him, he was already thinking 2 steps ahead.
The trial date for the killing of Officer O'Malley was set for February the 9th. Paquette turned the courtroom into a stage, challenging the chains John was cuffed to, ridiculing the heavy security, and painting the prosecution as heavy-handed. Judge Murray wasn't prepared for it. The outcome was immediate: handcuffs off, guns removed, and the trial pushed back to March the 12th. Rumours circulated that John might be transferred to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, the very place he had helped his comrades escape from. The thought sent John into a panic. Knowing that Crown Point Jail was far easier to break out of, he pleaded with Paquette to intervene, and Paquette stepped in decisively. When Estill and Sheriff Holly moved to approve the transfer, Paquette skillfully appealed to Holly's pride, turning the decision around in their favour. Estill fumed in frustration, but the judge ultimately sided with Holly. John would remain at Crown Point Jail, which Sheriff Holly had declared as the strongest and most secure prison in Indiana, one she deemed impossible to escape. They doubled down on security, calling in the National Guard and fortifying the jail with machine guns, spot checks, and steel reinforcements, transforming the place into what looked like a war zone. Then came a moment that changed everything. A week after his arrest, John slipped a small, rolled-up note to Paquette's investigator, Arthur O'Leary. It was disguised as a love letter to Billy Frechette to throw the guards off that would search O'Leary upon leaving. But Paquette discovered another piece of paper hidden within the envelope and found something else entirely. It was a full map of the Crown Point Jail and detailed escape instructions. John told him to pass it to his gang. Stealth, blowtorches, and operating at the dead of night were all part of the plan to break John out from the outside, with Hamilton set to lead the operation. However, Hamilton wasn't ready. Still recovering from wounds sustained during the East Chicago bank heist, and with only Homer Van Meter and himself at large, reinforcements were desperately needed. That's when they turned to a Chicago bank robber called Babyface Nelson. Nelson was a crazed, homicidal maniac who thrived on bloodshed and chaos, hardly the calm presence Dillinger preferred, but there was no denying that Nelson was making a name for himself. Unlike Dillinger's more calculated approach, Nelson was loud, reckless, and unapologetically violent, but undeniably effective.
My name's Big George Nelson, and how many people I kill today is gonna be up to you. I don't care if you're a man, woman, or child, you cross me, you end up in a box.
Van Meter knew Nelson well. A few months earlier, Nelson had approached him asking to join the Dillinger gang, but Van Meter had turned him down, knowing that Pierpont and Dillinger wouldn't approve. Now the tables had turned, and Nelson was brought into the Dillinger gang with open arms. True to form, he wasted no time in offering a stereotypical but brutal solution to Dillinger's problem: blow off the gates of Crown Point Jail with dynamite. His plan was fast, loud and violent: a full-on assault to storm the jail, level the walls, and grab John during the chaos.
But John wasn't buying it. Communicating through Louis Paquette, he shut the whole idea down cold. There were too many guns, too many cops, and too many chances for someone to die. The jail was already on high alert, bracing for exactly such an attempt, and a noisy rescue would only end in bloodshed. So the plan changed. O'Leary suggested something simpler: a wooden gun. He had read about it in a failed escape in Wisconsin where a prisoner tried it, but John wasn't sold at first. But the more he sat in that cell, the more he knew. He had no other choice. Meanwhile, Paquette was building an actual defense in the form of witnesses in Florida. He had a real shot at beating the O'Malley charges and begged John to wait and to give it a chance, but John had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to play the state's game, he was going to vanish again. On March the 3rd, 1934, John Dillinger pulled off the impossible and escaped from Crown Point Jail. It was a masterclass in cunning and preparation. For weeks, Dillinger had carefully played the part of the model prisoner, volunteering for the worst duties, emptying slop jars, smiling at guards, and keeping his head down with calculated discipline. The jailers, thinking they had broken his spirit, nicknamed him John the Whittler, as they mocked the way he quietly carved wood in his cell, never suspecting that the block in his hands was being shaped into his ticket to freedom. He worked meticulously, crafting a crude pistol out of wood, staining it with shoe polish to darken its surface, fastening nails to resemble rudimentary sights, and attaching a thin sliver of razor blade to simulate a barrel, all while maintaining the illusion of harmless obedience. Then, on that Saturday morning during routine exercises, Dillinger made his move and put the plan into action. When 64-year-old jail trustee Sam Cahoon entered the exercise yard carrying soap, Dillinger pressed the fake gun into the man's side and snapped, "I'll blow you apart."
Don't you move or yell or I'll blow your guts all over the wall. I'm John Dillinger, boy, you better believe I'll do it.
Discarding any charm, he advanced swiftly through the jail, aided by the fact that the vehicle had no two-way radio and the jail had no way of alerting surrounding law enforcement agencies in time.
Although Youngblood successfully escaped with Dillinger, their partnership was short-lived. Less than 2 weeks later, on March the 16th, 1934, Youngblood was tracked down by police in Port Huron, Michigan, where a violent shootout erupted. A deputy was mortally wounded in the gunfire, and Youngblood himself was shot dead. Before dying, Youngblood told the Dillinger squad that John was hiding out in Port Huron. This sent Frank Reynolds and his men on a wild goose chase until they returned moments before Youngblood's death, when he smirked and told the feds that he was lying and he had absolutely no idea where Dillinger was. By the time that the Dillinger squad had caught their breath, the newspapers had hit the stands. John Dillinger, America's most wanted man, was already gone, already on the move. Just like that, he had vanished once more, and the greatest manhunt in American history was about to enter a new chapter.
John Dillinger was free, but he needed cash, and a lot of it. Between the lawsuits, hideouts, bribes, and his dream of skipping town to Mexico or South America, John needed another big score, and he needed it fast. But this time, he didn't have his old crew. Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark were on trial in Ohio, about to face the music for the murder of Sheriff Jess Saba during the Ohio jail breakout. With the help of his old pal Van Meter, John linked up with the hot-blooded babyface Nelson.
Who's the babyface? The one I wrote you about. His name's Gillis.
My name is Nelson.
Standing at just over 5 feet tall, with a twitchy trigger finger and a grin that never quite matched his eyes, Nelson was everything John wasn't. Impulsive, unhinged, and loud. But he had a crew. Seasoned bank robbers John Paul Chase, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green. And they had guns, cars, and ambition. On March the 6th, The second Dillinger gang robbed the Security National Bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Nelson, already famous for shooting first, burst in swinging his Thompson submachine gun. John stayed calm, walked in through the front, pointed his gun at the ceiling, and shouted for everyone to lie down. The vault was cleared in minutes, no deaths but plenty of chaos. The gang got away clean. A week later, they went after something bigger, the First National Bank of Mason City. It was supposed to be an easy job. It was a quiet town, no real crime to speak of, but the bank, it held $240,000, an absolute fortune in the middle of the Great Depression. John sent Green and Van Meter in first, pretending to be out-of-towners looking for work. They stayed at the YMCA across the road, watched the bank for days, made notes and learned faces. But they missed one crucial detail. A steel cage 15 feet above the bank lobby housed a guard named Tom Walters, armed with a tear gas cannon, and that was going to be a problem come March the 13th, 1934. It was cold and snowy that day. At 2:20 p.m, a dark Buick pulled up to the First National Bank. John, Nelson, Carol Van Meter, Green and Red Hamilton, back from his injury, were inside. They double parked near the alley and then the gang moved fast.
Nelson took the alley, Carol guarded the corner drugstore, John, Hamilton, Green and Van Meter went inside. They fired shots in the air, shouting for everyone to hit the floor. Most dropped immediately. Some of the younger women lay on their backs and John walked by, smirking. "On your faces, ladies," he said. "This is not a director's meeting." Cashier Harry Fisher was the only one who knew the vault combination. Green grabbed him and pulled him toward the vault, but Fisher had other plans. He claimed that he couldn't see through the tear gas, and as Green turned his head for just a second, Fisher seized the chance and slipped behind the door and locked the second entrance, trapping himself safely inside. Green cursed and shouted. Inside the vault, Fisher began handing out small bundles of cash through the bars, mostly $1 bills, and he handed them one by one. When John Hamilton realised what was happening, he screamed, "Hand over the big bills or I'll shoot you." Fisher nodded, but he kept handing out the singles. Up above, Tom Walters, the steel cage guard, saw what was happening. He fired another tear gas round that smacked into Green's back, knocking him forward. Green fired back with his Tommy gun, but only managed to hit the bulletproof glass. Shards flew into Walters' cheek, and now the entire lobby was choking with gas, a thick, acrid fog that left employees, customers, even the robbers doubled over in fits of coughing. Their eyes burned as chaos spread. From the mezzanine, a bank worker lit another tear gas canister and hurled it down into the swirling confusion, only for it to be kicked away in panic, where it was promptly booted back by someone else, sending it rolling like a disorientated soccer ball through the crowd as the haze deepened and people wept openly, unable to escape the stinging assault on their senses.
Margaret Johnson, the bank's switchboard operator, remained composed under pressure. Rather than pulling the alarm and risking immediate gunfire, she silently connected the bank's main phone line to the central office, allowing the chaos and noise inside to be broadcast directly downtown. A subtle but brilliant move that would ultimately bring the police. Outside, babyface Nelson stood with his machine gun, grinning like a child lost in a game, opening fire on cars, storefronts, rooftops, anything that moved, fueled by adrenaline and a complete disregard for life. As fate would have it, a school board official named Raymond James happened to wander by, unaware of the unfolding violence, and Nelson, without hesitation, shot him in the leg before rifling through his pockets and muttering, "I thought you were a cop, you stupid bastard." When James's son ran forward in a desperate attempt to help his father, Nelson spun and opened fire on him as well, doubling down on the mayhem with cold, remorseless efficiency. Back inside, John saw it was getting heated. He started gathering hostages. They needed human shields to escape. He walked across the lobby, helped women to their feet, and formed a line. One woman couldn't hold her arms up any longer. "Get those hands higher," John snapped. He wasn't joking now, he was tense. As they exited the rear of the bank, they took 16 hostages. Some stood on the Buick's running boards, others crammed inside. One woman sat on her daughter's lap, another man perched on the bumper. It looked like a circus act. They rolled out of Mason City at 15 miles an hour. Police started chasing them, but the roads were crowded. Curious drivers and panicked citizens, and the cops got tangled up. The Buick made slow progress through town. It was like watching a parade, and anyone who got too close, the gang shot at them. One bullet struck a man in the knees and abdomen after bouncing through his car. Miraculously, somehow they made it out of town. They switched cars, dumped the Buick in a ditch, freed the hostages, and disappeared into thin air. They had expected a huge haul of $240,000. Instead, they got just $52,000, around $1 million today. Fisher's delaying tactics and the gas ruined their timing, but they had escaped, and they were alive. John Dillinger was already making plans. He needed enough money to disappear Mexico, maybe even South America. He knew that his luck, as unbelievable as it had been, couldn't last forever. Crown Point had been a miracle, Sioux Falls and Mason City had bought him time, but now the law was catching up. He'd seen what happened to the men he once looked up to. Back in Ohio, the courts had made examples out of his old crew. Harry Pierpont and Charles Mackley, the very men who had once mentored him inside Michigan State Prison. After their capture in Tucson, they were extradited to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff Saba during the Allen County prison escape. The courtroom was packed, the press itching for headlines, and the verdict was decided long before the jury returned. It took just hours to find the duo guilty. Their sentence was execution by electric chair at the Indiana State Reformatory. Meanwhile, Russell Clark received a life sentence and disappeared behind the walls of the same prison where his friends would die. For John, there would be no last-minute rescue this time. The Ohio State Penitentiary was sealed tighter than Fort Knox. Their plans, their power, and now their lives soon to be gone. And John knew that if he didn't disappear soon, that was going to be his story too. And he did just that. After the Mason City job, John, Billy, Hamilton, Van Meter and Tommy Carroll retreated north, crossing into St. Paul, Minnesota, where they had friends, security, and just enough distance to breathe. They needed quiet. They had to lay low whilst the heat cooled off. John was growing paranoid. Every siren made him tense. Every stranger looked like a copper. He didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew he was tired, he was hunted, and he was running out of time. They settled into a small third-floor apartment at Lincoln Court, a clean red brick building in the middle of a quiet neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota. Billy signed the lease as Mrs. Carl T. Hellman, claiming her husband was an engineer recovering from surgery. She dressed simple and tried to act polite, but something was always off. She didn't like the landlady or the way that she asked too many questions, and the landlady, in turn, grew suspicious of the quiet couple upstairs who kept to themselves a little too much. They arrived quietly, carrying 2 suitcases and a few bags. Nothing flashy, but they brought more than just clothes. Hidden inside were machine guns, pistols, ammo belts, and cash from their previous robberies. Van Meter and Carroll stayed nearby, checking in when needed, while the plan was meant to be temporary. Just 2 weeks at most, enough time for Hamilton to heal and for John to figure out his next move. However, trouble came early.
The building's manager lived just downstairs, and she was sharp and suspicious from the moment that she met Billy. Something didn't sit right with her. The man upstairs, Mr. Hellman, barely spoke. and when she did hear his voice through the vents, it didn't sound like someone recovering from surgery. The things he was saying, it sounded like someone dangerous. Concerned, she contacted the St. Paul police and told them that she believed that a wanted man was living in her building.
By the end of March, the federal government had eyes in every corner of St. Paul. They didn't know for sure it was John, but they knew that someone big was holed up inside Lincoln Court. Surveillance was set up. Agents rotated shifts across the street, watching the front door through binoculars and camera lenses. Meanwhile, a tip came into the FBI St. Paul office. A man who looked like John Dillinger was living with a woman who strongly resembled Billy Frechette. The name on the lease was Hellman, and the Bureau couldn't ignore it. On the evening of March the 31st, 1934, 2 federal agents went up the stairs of the Lincoln Court apartment building and knocked on the door. Billy answered. She stayed calm. She told them her husband was in bed, resting. The agents didn't back down and wanted to speak to Mr. Hellman. She nodded and turned away, heading into the bedroom, where John was already grabbing his clothes and loading his machine gun. As all this was taking place upstairs, Homer Van Meter arrived. He hadn't expected to see lawmen at the door, so thinking fast, he introduced himself as a salesman, claiming he was there to show some soap samples. One of the agents asked to see them, and Van Meter agreed and led the agent downstairs. But when they reached the front entrance, Van Meter pulled a pistol, stepped back, and snarled, "You wanted trouble. Now you're going to get it." The agent turned and bolted through the front door. Van Meter opened fire, and the agent fired back. In the confusion, Van Meter vanished around the side of the building and escaped through the rear, disappearing into the night. Back upstairs, the situation exploded. John, machine gun in hand, opened fire from the apartment door, raking the hallway with bullets. One of the agents dove for cover, pinned down in the corridor. The sound of gunfire shattered the calm of the neighborhood. Inside the apartment, Billy grabbed a bag, money and supplies, whatever she could carry, and bolted down the stairs. John followed her, blood soaking through his trouser leg from a fresh gunshot wound.
Just moments earlier, as Federal Agent Cummins attempted to breach the door, John had opened fire with a Thompson submachine gun, spraying through the wood and sending Cummins diving for cover. Then, John kicked open the door and fired another burst down the hallway. Cummins returned fire with his revolver, emptying 5 shots, one of which actually did strike John in the left calf, but he ran out of ammunition and had no choice but to retreat down the stairs towards the front entrance. Wasting no time, John and Billy made their move. They slipped down the back stairs and exited through the rear door. Limping and with his machine gun still in hand, John climbed into Van Meter's car with Billy, and together they vanished once more. News of the botched raid infuriated the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. Their failure in St. Paul was a national embarrassment, so he sent in Hugh Clegg, one of his top men, to take control. Clegg moved quickly, launching a sweep of known hideouts and suspected contacts in the area. One apartment in particular stood out, and under surveillance, agents noticed that a cleaning woman arrived. They brought her in for questioning, and she mentioned that someone was coming to her home tonight to pay her. That man turned out to be Eddie Green.
When Green showed up, the Bureau agents were waiting. He wasn't armed, but that didn't matter. They opened fire anyway, hitting him multiple times in the head. Bleeding out, Green begged for pain relief. The agents agreed, but only if he gave them something in return. In agony, he gave them names, associates, locations, and allies of John. A week later, Eddie Green died from infection in a hospital bed. And, on the other hand, John did something that nobody expected. On April the 5th, he and Billy returned to Mooresville, to his father's farm. John hadn't been home in years. The land was quiet, the farmhouse unchanged, but everything felt different now. His feds are everywhere, they're watching the hills. John already knew he'd taken precautions. The next day, on April the 6th, John reached out to his family, reconnecting with his half-brother Hubert. That night, they drove 210 miles northeast to Leipzig, Ohio, hoping to speak with Harry Pierpont's parents. But the Pierponts weren't home, so they turned around and headed back. Near Noblesville, Indiana, Hubert fell asleep behind the wheel. The car veered off the road, crashed through a fence, and landed deep in the woods. They limped back to the Mooresville farm just before sunrise. By morning, police swarmed the crash site. Inside the wrecked car, officers found maps, a machine gun magazine, a coil of rope, and a bullwhip. That weekend, they bought a new black Ford V8 under the name Mrs. Fred Penfield, which was Billy's alias. On April the 7th, a photograph was taken at the Mooresville farm that would become one of the most iconic images in American crime history. John Dillinger grinning, Tommy gun in hand, posing like a folk hero in his own front yard. The law was watching. Agents from the FBI were circling the property, blending into the countryside, but the family tried to enjoy one last moment of peace. On Sunday, April the 8th, the family had a picnic while two FBI agents cruised nearby. Suspicious of the FBI's presence, the group split up. John lay hidden on the floor of the V8 while Billy drove with two of his nieces as decoys. The FBI agents passed them without recognising the man hiding just below the window was the most wanted man in the country. But even for John, the FBI was too close now, so on the night of April the 9th, his cousin Norman Dillinger drove John and Billy to Chicago to get them away from the tightening circle. In the middle of the journey back, John called a friend named Larry Strong and asked if there was somewhere safe where they could rest. Larry told him to come down to the State Austin Inn, a tavern at 416 North State Street in Chicago that he owned. However, it was a setup. Larry had flipped and called the FBI, and John had no idea. He parked nearby and sent Billy inside first to check it out, but as soon as she walked through the door, agents pounced. From across the street, John watched everything, the way they swarmed her, shoved her against the wall, and snapped on the cuffs. He didn't move or shout, he just stared for a moment before driving away, and that would be the last time that he ever saw her. He left word for Louis Paquette to handle her case, to do whatever he could. Billy, fiery as ever, was brought to the FBI's headquarters, the banker's building at 105 West Adams Street in Chicago, now the Clark Adams building, where she was interrogated all night. She didn't give them much, just attitude. At one point, she even told them that John had walked right past their agents at the tavern, calm, hands in his pockets, while they were too busy celebrating to notice. She was bluffing, but they didn't know that. Meanwhile, John was back with Van Meter, back to basics, robbing banks, and pretending that nothing tragic had happened to his girl. On the 12th of April, they robbed the Warsaw, Indiana police station, stealing 2 revolvers and 4 bulletproof vests. No disguises, no getaway car parked around the corner. They just walked in, took what they wanted, and walked out. Between April the 13th and April the 20th, sightings came in from everywhere. Pittsburgh, South Bend, Fort Wayne, Niles, but truthfully, no one really knew where he was. Some said he never left Chicago again, and maybe that was true, because from this point forward, John wasn't looking to run. He was getting ready to go out swinging. As John tried to get on with things, Billy's scream still echoed in his ears. He hadn't looked back as he drove away from the State Austin Inn, and he couldn't now, not after that moment. In that single instant, the only person he had ever truly let in had been taken from him, and he watched it happen from across the street, paralysed and helpless, seeing her struggle as agents tackled her
to the floor. Now, all he had left was what was left of his crew. He and Van Meter were circling Chicago's outskirts, laying low, and babyface Nelson had been stirring up trouble again. He was wild, unstable, dangerous, but useful. Tommy Carroll and John Hamilton were also still in the fold. Both were reliable.
On April the 20th, 1934, the four men, along with Nelson's wife Helen, Hamilton's girl Pat Sherrington, and Van Meter's new sweetheart Maria Conforti, packed up and headed north in separate vehicles. John took a Ford coupe, Nelson drove a Hudson sedan. They slipped into Wisconsin under grey skies, past dairy farms and pine forests, trading the city's heat for the still cold of the northern woods. Their destination was Little Bohemia Lodge, a rustic cedar-lined retreat tucked along the edge of Little Star Lake in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin. It was remote, isolated, and the kind of place no person would stumble into by accident. But this wasn't a random choice. In 1929, a guy named Emil Wanatka built the cozy lodge as it was his dream of owning a peaceful retreat. But by 1934, those dreams were wearing thin. The Depression hadn't been kind to vacation spots in the Northwoods. Business was slow, and fate, as it often does in stories like this, delivered a stranger to his door, though perhaps not a stranger at all. You see, Winotka's attorney was Louis Paquette, the same flashy, infamous lawyer representing none other than John Dillinger. It was no secret that Paquette had greased more than a few palms for the outlaw type. He helped John escape Crown Point with a wooden gun. He arranged hideouts, plastic surgery, underworld safe houses. Paquette knew the right people, he knew who to trust, and he knew Emil Winotka. So, when John chose Little Bohemia as a retreat, it wasn't chance, it was a calculated play. Whether Paquette struck a deal with Winotka or simply nudged him into silence, we'll never know. One thing was certain, Winotka knew that the men arriving at his lodge were dangerous, but their identities remained a mystery to him.
On Friday, April the 20th, the first group arrived, Homer Van Meter and Marie Conforti. Van Meter greeted Winotka like an old friend, asked if lunch was being served, and said that more guests would arrive later. Staff carried in their heavy suitcases, one so heavy it felt like it was full of metal. Van Meter warned them to not ask questions. The rest arrived at around 5 p.m, and as soon as Winotka noticed them, his stomach tightened. He'd seen these men before, but where exactly? He held his tongue, determined not to speak until he was sure. Ignoring his intrusive thoughts, Winotka assigned them rooms. John stayed just up the stairs to the left. Nelson and his wife stayed in the cottage. That night, the group ate steak for dinner, relaxed, and played some cards. Some walked near the lake, checking escape routes. They didn't like that there was only one road in and one road out. If police came, they could be trapped. They decided that the lake's shoreline would be their best escape. Well, except for Nelson, because he didn't like following plans.
They all played poker until the wee hours. Winotka joined for a few hands, but the stakes were too high. As John leaned over to collect his winnings, Winotka caught a glimpse beneath his coat, 2 heavy pistols. Winotka started noticing things, strange behaviour, nervous energy. He went into the kitchen, rifled through old newspapers, and there, John's face stared back at him from the front page. He barely slept that night, neither did his wife. They heard footsteps pacing up and down, doors creaking and keys jingling.
What are you looking at me for?
The next morning, Tommy Carroll rose early. Carroll greeted him cheerfully and asked for breakfast. Winotka asked him to wake the others for the first meal of the day. Later that morning, Winotka took John aside and admitted that he'd recognised him from the newspapers. He said he didn't want any problems, his home and his family were all he had. John responded calmly. There would be no trouble, he said. They were only there to rest and they wouldn't stay long. John was calm and composed, and he just wanted to relax for once in his life. However, the others stayed alert. They watched every visitor, and when the phone rang, they listened closely.
As the morning wore on, Emil Winnotka Jr., just 8 years old, started throwing baseballs around with babyface Nelson, but the child soon stopped as the throws from Nelson were too hard to catch. Mrs. Winnotka soon put a stop to their play as she planned to take Emil Jr. to a family gathering. It was the perfect reason to leave the lodge and seek help from what had essentially become a hostage situation. She approached John at the card table and asked for permission to take her son. John nodded. He told her to stick to her normal routine. The women of the gang even offered to handle the chores whilst she was away. This moment, quiet and respectful, didn't reflect a hostage situation, and even though John showed trust, Mrs. Winnotka remained uneasy. She had the feeling that someone was tailing her, and she was right. Babyface Nelson had followed her, suspicious by nature, but this time he had good cause.
Mrs. Winnotka, determined to warn someone, picked up her brother Lloyd in Manitowish. From there, she drove to Mercer, where she mailed a letter to George Fisher, the Assistant District Attorney of Chicago. The letter revealed that John Dillinger and his men were hiding at the lodge. At the family gathering, she spoke with her brothers Henry and Lloyd and her in-law Henry Voss. No photos have survived of any of them, but together they devised a plan. Voss would call the Milwaukee Police Department on Sunday if Emil Winnotka gave his approval. If given the go-ahead, Voss would drive 60 miles to make the call to avoid suspicion or being followed by any of the gang. Milwaukee police instructed him to also reach out to Special Agent Melvin Purvis of the FBI in Chicago, which he did. Purvis confirmed he would be there soon. He chartered 2 planes full of agents and arranged to land at Rhinelander Airport. Purvis asked Voss to meet them there, and he agreed. Plans for the raid were now moving swiftly. When Purvis landed in Rhinelander, the ground was covered in patches of snow. Lawmen from surrounding towns were already there, along with Henry Voss. The snow was thick, but still, they pressed on. Voss drew a quick sketch of the lodge's layout for Purvis, but in his rush, he left out crucial details like the ditch on one side, the barbed wire on the other, and the presence of 2 highly alert watchdogs. Just after 7 PM, 5 cars full of agents left Rhinelander and began the difficult drive north. The roads were soaked, muddy, and full of holes. 2 of the cars broke down, forcing several agents to ride clinging to the running boards of the 3 remaining vehicles. Eventually, they arrived at the lodge. Purvis ordered all headlights turned off and no one was allowed to smoke. The sky was dark as snow fell lightly. At the entrance to Little Bohemia, 2 vehicles were parked across the road to block any escape. Agents crept forward through the woods in silence. Tommy Carroll had also gone north, hoping to rejoin the others, but realizing he was alone, he hotwired a Packard at a nearby resort and vanished. Babyface Nelson was the last to leave. Refusing to retreat, he stayed behind and fought. He exchanged fire with Purvis and killed an FBI agent before fleeing into the woods. After what felt like a lifetime of sustained gunfire, a voice shouted from inside, "Stop shooting, we'll come out." Winnotka, his wife, Helen Gillis, Pat Sherrington, and Marie Conforti surrendered. All were arrested, all were shaken, all was silent.
But John Dillinger was gone. Their prize had slipped away again. The FBI had failed again. And as the sun rose over the snowy pines of Manitowish waters, as smoke curled from the bullet-ridden lodge, the myth of John Dillinger only grew stronger. He was out there, somewhere in the woods. He was still breathing, and he was still free.
The night of the Battle of Little Bohemia Lodge wasn't a clean escape. It was a bloody, limping retreat through the wilderness. Hamilton, already weakened from previous injuries, had taken 2 bullets in the chaos and collapsed multiple times along the way. Desperate, John drove him back to Chicago, bloodied and fading fast.
Shut the hell up, we will find him a doctor.
Placing what little hope remained in the hands of the notorious underworld surgeon, Dr. Charles Moran. If anyone could bring Hamilton back from the brink, it was Moran, but the effort came too late. With no chance of recovery, Hamilton was taken to a remote shack near an abandoned mine outside Jenkinsville, Wisconsin. Surrounded by silence and suffering, he held on for several agonizing days until death finally came. The gang, unwilling to risk exposure, transported his body to Oswego, Illinois, where they poured lye over his face and hands to erase any identifying features before burying him in secret. Dillinger knew they couldn't stay in enemy territory anymore. The air was full of federal bloodhounds, so they turned back to what was left of the Chicago underworld. It was the only thing that hadn't abandoned them yet. Back in Chicago, John vanished into the city like a ghost. The press raged. Dillinger escapes FBI raid, headlines screamed. Publicly, J. Edgar Hoover fumed. Privately, he was humiliated. The raid at Little Bohemia had been a disaster. 1 dead civilian, a dead FBI agent, several wounded, and not a single gangster bagged. The Bureau doubled down on the manhunt, and Hoover issued a new shoot-to-kill order. Agents were told to bring Dillinger in dead, not alive.
John Dillinger, the most wanted man in America, couldn't walk 10 feet without risking arrest. Photos of his crooked smile were posted in every single train station, post office and gas station. He needed to become someone else, literally, and he needed a new face. So he turned to the underworld doctor of last resort, Wilhelm Lazur. Lazur was a German-born physician who'd lost his license and made his living fixing mobsters. John's procedure was arranged for the end of May 1934 to be performed in a small Chicago apartment belonging to James Probasco, a 67-year-old friend of John's lawyer, Louis Paquette. But what Probasco didn't know is that his quiet favour would come back to haunt him. On July the 27th, whilst in federal custody, Probasco fell to his death from the 19th floor of the Bankers Building in downtown Chicago, the same building that housed the FBI's headquarters, which is where Probasco was, and the very same place where Billy Frechette had been interrogated just weeks earlier. In that very same apartment, John had laid back on a blood-stained bed while Lazur went to work with a scalpel, bleach and chemicals. It was crude, it was painful, it was dangerous. Lazur cut behind John's ears and peeled back the skin, sliced cartilage from his nose and burned off scars with chemicals whilst injecting concoctions that were meant to swell and distort his features. Then came the fingerprints. Lazur soaked John's hands in acid, scraping off the ridges with a scalpel.
The process took hours. John drifted in and out of consciousness, moaning under the rag drenched in chloroform stuffed into his mouth. When it was done, he looked in the mirror. It wasn't worth the pain at all. His new appearance was only meant to be temporary, but he was still recognisable. Additionally, the acid treatment did not successfully destroy John's fingertips, which would later be used to confirm his identity. Through forgeries and bribes, John Dillinger became James Lawrence. A fresh start, a new identity, as clean as he could be. To sell the illusion, he took up with Polly Hamilton, a sweet-faced waitress in her early 20s who lived with her landlady and protector, Anna Sage, the infamous madam of the Chicago underworld. Polly had a difficult past. She was a teenage runaway from Fargo, North Dakota, who had once worked in Anna Sage's brothel in Gary, Indiana. By the summer of 1934, she was working at the S&S sandwich shop at 1209 Wilson Avenue and living with Anna and Anna's 24-year-old son Steve at 2858 Clark Street in Chicago. Anna, whose real name was Anna Campagnas, had a long history in organised crime. Born Anna Ivanova Akalieva, she was under pressure from federal authorities. Because of her criminal background, she was being threatened with deportation back to Romania. The FBI offered her a deal, cooperation in exchange for help with her immigration status, but she didn't agree immediately, not until she knew she had something to sell.
Meanwhile, John resumed life in the shadows. He visited Polly by night, walked with her by the lake, and even took her to ball games. He played the role of both boyfriend and ghost. He introduced himself as Jimmy Lawrence to others and told people that he worked as a clerk at the Chicago Board of Trade. It's not quite known just how many banks John robbed during this 2 to 3 month period, maybe 4, maybe 5, but when the Chicago Police Department found his blood-splattered getaway car on a Chicago street, well, they knew he was in the city. By the summer of 1934, the Bureau of Investigation was no longer a passive observer of America's crime wave. It had become a full-blown federal manhunt machine, and it started with blood.
On June the 17th, outside Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri, gunmen ambushed federal agents in broad daylight during a prisoner transfer. The shootout left 4 lawmen and their prisoner dead. The Kansas City Massacre, as it was known, shocked the nation and gave J. Edgar Hoover the moment he needed. He used the tragedy to demand sweeping powers from Congress, authority for his agents to make arrests, carry firearms, chase fugitives across state lines, and hit back with lethal force.
This means that to protect the lives and property of the citizens of this country against a most deadly type of slayer, it was necessary for local law enforcement officers somewhere in the United States to each day, every day of the year, protect their own lives by shooting to kill.
Killing or assaulting a federal officer now carried severe penalties. Rewards of up to $25,000 were offered for the most dangerous criminals.
And Hoover made it personal. He didn't just want arrests, he wanted headlines, accountability, and absolute dominance over organised crime. At this point, he unveiled the Bureau's first public enemies list, transforming wanted posters into a national campaign of humiliation and psychological warfare. To Hoover, this wasn't just a list. It was a declaration that these men were already as good as dead. Behind the scenes, the FBI was undergoing a radical transformation, abandoning the slow, reactive tactics of the old Bureau of Investigation and adopting an arsenal of modern, offensive strategies.
Fingerprint analysis became a cornerstone of their investigations. The Bureau created a centralized fingerprint database that allowed agents to track suspects operating under multiple aliases across state lines. Ballistics experts matched bullets and shell casings to specific weapons, tying gang members to shootouts and bank robberies with scientific precision. Wiretapping, once seen as legally dubious, became a regular tool. Phone lines were tapped, conversations recorded, and the Bureau began embedding informants and undercover agents directly into criminal networks, gathering intelligence that local police could never access. The FBI also pioneered coordinated interstate tracking. Since fugitives like Dillinger frequently crossed state lines to avoid capture, Hoover organized seamless cooperation between federal, state, and local authorities, a level of integration the old Bureau had never achieved. To support these operations, they even began using airplanes for aerial surveillance and rapid response, a tactic that was revolutionary at the time. This system included mugshots, fingerprints, aliases, and detailed criminal histories, ensuring that no matter where a suspect was arrested, their record would follow. They also introduced early psychological profiling. While crude by today's standards, it helped agents recognize patterns, anticipate movements, and make calculated decisions about where and how to strike. Agents were also formally trained in marksmanship, pursuit, and tactical raids, a direct response to the botched shootouts that had embarrassed the Bureau in the past.
In Hoover's mind, this wasn't just about justice, it was about control, legacy, and proving that no outlaw, no matter how clever or charismatic, could outlast the reach of a modern federal manhunt. And at the top of his public enemies list was John Dillinger. Second was Babyface Nelson, and close behind was Charlie, Pretty Boy Floyd. Authorities believed that Floyd was the main shooter in the Kansas City ambush. This wasn't true though. He was fast, deadly, and unpredictable. This was true, and the feds now blamed him for the massacre and were hunting him hard. Dillinger, truth be told, had grown tired of Babyface Nelson. Nelson's quick trigger temper and reckless bloodlust made every job a risk, and Dillinger needed someone more precise, more calm, and Floyd fit the bill. So that June, the two of them joined forces.
On the morning of June the 30th, 1934, they hit the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. At 11:30 a.m, a brown Hudson pulled up to the curb. Inside was Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Raymond Fatso Negri, a member of Nelson's gang who had preferred Dillinger's methods, and Homer Van Meter. Van Meter stood guard on the sidewalk, whilst Dillinger, Floyd and Negri burst through the bank's front doors. "This is a hold-up," Dillinger shouted. Pretty Boy Floyd wasted no time. He sprayed a burst from his Thompson submachine gun into the ceiling, rattling the rafters and sending customers into a panic. People hit the floor, screams echoed off the marble walls. Behind the counter, Dillinger and Floyd forced tellers to open their drawers, scooping cash into bags. Negri marched the guards into a back room at gunpoint and covered the rear. The robbery was fast, methodical, but outside, things were about to go south. A traffic officer named Howard Wagner, standing just down the block, heard what sounded like gunfire. As he stepped towards the bank, Van Meter levelled his rifle and fired. Wagner dropped face first to the pavement and he was dead before he hit the ground. Inside, the gunfire was a signal to move. The robbers had to leave fast. They grabbed what they could, but it wasn't much, just under $5,000. Released the captives miles out of town. No one in the gang was caught, but no one came back to South Bend.
It was one of the few times, or perhaps the only time, that Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd worked together, and it proved to everyone just how high the stakes had become. With Hoover's men closing in and new federal laws giving his agents near unlimited reach, the era of the motor bandits was running out of road, and John Dillinger only had a few days left. He just didn't know it.
Anna Sage was also running out of time. The immigration authorities were circling and a deportation loomed. So she went to the one man who could offer her a lifeline, Melvin Purvis. She told Purvis that Jimmy Lawrence, the man living with Polly, was in fact John Dillinger. Purvis didn't believe her until she gave exact details of his surgery, scars, and gun habits. If she could help bring John in, she wanted a promise that she wouldn't be deported. Purvis offered her nothing in writing, but he gave her his word. That was all she had. So she agreed to help and promised to wear an orange dress on the night of the operation so the agents could easily identify her. Now she just needed the perfect moment, and she got it on July the 22nd, 1934, and that day began like any other.
Summer heat baked the sidewalks. John rested shirtless in his room, reading the papers. Polly was curled beside him. At around 5 p.m, Anna Sage knocked on the door and asked if the two of them wanted to see a movie, to which they agreed. Anna knew that this was her chance, but she needed a reason to leave the apartment without raising suspicion. Thinking on her feet, she knew that the three of them planned to have fried chicken for dinner that night, so she told Polly that she needed to go outside to the store to buy butter. Once outside, she walked to a nearby payphone and called Melvin Purvis, giving him the update. She then brought the butter and returned home without delay, making sure that Polly would not suspect that she'd spoken to anyone.
That night, they headed to the Biograph Theatre on Lincoln Avenue to see Manhattan Melodrama, a crime drama starring Clark Gable. John, ever the romantic of his own legend, must have found it poetic. 3 tickets, one for Anna in her orange dress, though under the marquee lights it glowed red. The FBI would later call her the woman in red, though she'd worn orange. By 8 p.m, Purvis had every available man in position. Dozens of agents in fedoras and dark suits lined the block. Sharpshooters hid behind cars, and the crowd grew with whispers of what was about to happen. Inside the theatre, John watched the film. He laughed at the jokes. He whispered to Polly during the quiet scenes. He had no idea. A crowd formed within minutes. Some were horrified, others didn't wait. Souvenir hunters dipped newspapers, skirts and handkerchiefs into the fresh blood, eager to take a piece of the moment. Photographers flooded the scene. Flashbulbs lit the alley like a crime scene under strobe lights. John was taken to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, where he was officially pronounced dead. Winstead was later believed to have fired the fatal shot and received a personal letter of commendation from J. Edgar Hoover.
The man who'd robbed banks in broad daylight, escaped jails with wooden guns, survived countless shootouts and betrayed nobody in interrogations, was gone. John's body was taken to the Cook County morgue and hundreds lined up to view the corpse. Many wept, others cheered, some whispered it wasn't him, and immediately conspiracy theories rose. The corpse had a different eye colour and different ears. John Dillinger Sr., his father, well, his first words when he seen the corpse was, "That is not my son." But the autopsy confirmed what was left of the scars and the fingerprints, that it was indeed John Dillinger.
Anna Sage was deported anyway, despite her cooperation. Hoover never intended to keep the promise. She died in obscurity in Romania in 1947. Polly Hamilton vanished from the public eye, her story buried beneath years of silence and guilt, dying in 1969. Billy Frechette served 2 years for harbouring Dillinger before being released in 1936 and running a travelling show with the Dillinger family called Crime Doesn't Pay. She was married a further 3 times and died of cancer in 1969 at the age of 61. As for Melvin Purvis, well, he got his victory, but not for long. Hoover resented Purvis's fame and pushed him out of the bureau within a year. He died by suicide in 1960, still haunted by the ghosts of Chicago. As for the rest of the Dillinger gang, Tommy Carroll was gunned down less than a month before John, shot in the face by police during a shootout in Waterloo, Iowa on June 7th, 1934. He died the next day. Homer Van Meter, once the most loyal of John's crew, lasted just weeks longer. On August 23rd, he was cornered in an alley in St. Paul, Minnesota, and shot down by police in broad daylight, his body left sprawled on the sidewalk.
Scratch. One public enemy.
Well, there's Homer Van Meter.
Pretty Boy Floyd outlasted Dillinger by a mere 3 months. Babyface Nelson, the most volatile of them all, went out in a storm of bullets on November the 27th, 1934 in Barrington, Illinois. He killed 2 federal agents in a furious gun battle before succumbing to 17 bullet wounds of his own. On September the 22nd, 1934, Charles Mackley and Harry Pierpont tried to break out of prison with hacksaw blades and other weapons. Mid-escape, guards opened fire and Mackley was shot dead. Pierpont survived, only to be strapped, wounded and silent, into the electric chair weeks later and executed on October the 17th. The Dillinger gang was no more. John Dillinger's body was returned to Mooresville, then brought to Harvey Funeral Home in Indianapolis, located at the southeast corner of Indiana and Harrison Streets. On July the 25th, 1934, during a brutal 103 degrees heatwave, hundreds lined up in the streets, circling the block twice, just to catch a glimpse of the man who had defied the law, outwitted the government, and captured the country's imagination. His body was later laid to rest at Crown Hill Cemetery. People still visit, some leave flowers, some steal dirt, and some just stand in silence.
To some, he was a criminal, to others, a Depression-era Robin Hood. In reality, he was a man who was always built for the chaos, born in the wrong time with too much charm, far too little fear, and a head full of dangerous ideas. On a hot July night in 1934 outside a theatre on Lincoln Avenue, John Dillinger's time finally ran out, but his legend never did. Without a doubt, my favourite video that I've done so far, and one that I was saving for a while for that exact reason. I hope you enjoyed the story of John Dillinger as much as I did, and as always, thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe and consider giving the video a thumbs up. You can also become a channel member as well, where for just $5 a month you'll receive access to our members only Discord, monthly live streams and videos, and much more. So if that sounds of interest to you, then please consider becoming a member. If not, it's absolutely fine. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.